So good morning. I'm Rob Hopkins from Transition Network. And so Transition Network supports the transition movement, which we started in the UK in 2005, 2006, as a bottom-up, community-led experiment in building more resilient communities. So our take has been that climate change is of such a scale that it requires a change in the scale on which we do things, and that making local economies more resilient is really important. So we work to support communities in building local food, new local food networks, local economic networks, community energy companies, that kind of thing, based on the idea of how do we enable money as much as possible to stay locally. It's positive, optimistic. People start repair cafes, local currencies, they start their own housing projects, their own energy companies, all kinds of different things. And we started it in my town of Totnes in Devon in 2006. And around 2006, I walked into a building on my high street, and there was this hanging on the wall, which was a £1 note made by the Bank of Totnes in 1810. And I had no idea that such a thing was even possible. It even happened. And I was really curious about this, and what would happen if we just made some more? Was there a special room in the basement of the Tower of London that was just reserved for people who tried to print their own money? So we just had a go, and we created an event. We printed 300 of these notes that were, one side was a facsimile of those old notes, and the other side told you the 18 shops that would take them. And we ran it as an experiment for 3 months, and people really loved it. And it was something that then started to then evolved into a different kind of notes, and then other kinds of notes. In 2013, we had a launch, because we realized actually just having a pocket full of £1 notes isn't really very helpful if you want to go and buy the shopping for your family for the week. So we then had a 1, a 5, a 10, and a £21 note. And people say, why do you have a £21 note? And we say, well, why not? And for me, there's something really playful and lovely about being the town that has a £21 note. There was a film called Tomorrow that this appeared in, and if people don't know anything about our little town in Devon, they know that we have a £21 note. So then, for many people, it's been a great experience having this. We tried to have the same digital currency that Bristol had. So this is run for a while. Obviously, they're not that big. That would make shopping quite exhausting process, I think. They're just the normal kind of size. But actually, we ran the Totnes Pound as a scheme for 12 years. And this Wednesday, we're going to be closing the Totnes Pound because the circulation of cash has fallen, of printed notes, has fallen to a point where we can't really sustain the scheme anymore. So I don't stand before you today to say, I have all the answers, we've cracked it, it's fantastic, I know how to do it. But what's interesting for me about the Totnes Pound is that it has inspired many other places to have a go and to keep evolving this. And I loved the words that Thomas Edison said about the light bulb. He said he made 10,000 famously prototype light bulbs before he created the one that was actually commercially viable, and he said, I have not failed 10,000 times, I have not failed once. I have succeeded in proving that those 10,000 ways will not work. When I've eliminated the ways that will work, I will find the way that will work. Anyway, yeah, so many other places have then picked up this idea and are doing something similar. I was in Belgium last week, in this region, the Wallonie region. There are many different currencies that are popping up there, all across France and different places. And I love the kind of playfulness of people playing around like we did with our £21 note. So this is the currency called the Yar, where they have a 1, a 3, a 10 and a 30 denomination. This is another one that comes in a 13 denomination, something to do with them having 13 hills in their area or something. This is a coin currency from a place called Newcastle under Lyme, where they're working with kids who are kind of excluded from school and very low income families, and they're 3D printing these coins that the kids get in exchange for volunteering, and then they can exchange them in particular shops. The kids designed them, the kids made them. This is in the city of Exeter near me, where the Exeter pound had a 4.5 note to celebrate the 450th anniversary of their local canal. And for me, there's something really beautiful about about the printed notes. This is in Liège, where they have a 0 note. And I went to visit them and said, why do you have a 0 note? And they said, well, because sometimes you just want to say thank you and acknowledge something nice that someone has done for you. But, you don't want to put a value on it because that would be a bit creepy. But you just want to say, thank you very much. I really respect that. They also have a 0.5 note. They just launched in Brussels. This is the zine, which is a local currency for the city of Brussels. They have a 2.5, and they also have a 0 note as well in Brussels. For me, there's something that these notes do. So I guess I'm a weird choice of speaker for a conference on Bitcoin, because I almost and on blockchain, because I really don't understand blockchain at all. I have to confess, and so I'm a slightly odd choice. But what I want to speak up for is tangible things and real things, and the value of making tangible things in our culture. And for me, these printed notes do several things. They enable playfulness, which is really important, I think. They enable storytelling. This is the first Brixton pound, the £1 note, which features Olive Morris. And Olive Morris started the Brixton Black Women's Association back in the 1970s. She died when she was in her mid-20s, and her parents were there at the launch of the Brixton pound. This is the Bristol pound, £10 note on there. It tells the story of in the 1960s when when the Bristol Bus Company said that only white people could drive the buses, and there was inspired by the civil rights movement, there was a boycott of the buses for 2 or 3 years, and in the end the law was changed. That's not a story that you'll see in the city's museum, but it's a story that is celebrated on the local currency notes. I never knew, for example, until I saw the Brixton pound, £20 note, that Vincent van Gogh lived in Brixton. Who knew that? I didn't know that. So for me, there's something really important about tangible manifestations. This is kind of one of the most iconic transition currencies, having a £10 note with David Bowie on it. I often give talks and I hand around a fistful of local currencies from different places to people to have a look at. And that's the one that never comes back. There's something for me about, I would so much rather live in a world where we have David Bowie on our money than having the Queen on it, frankly. And there's something, so there's about enabling playfulness, there's enabling storytelling, and what with the story we want to tell about ourselves. There's enabling conversation and connection. One of the things for me that's most important in the transition movement is we're about building resilient communities. And resilient communities are communities that talk to each other, are the communities that have conversations. And there was a beautiful study in Bristol that found that when people went shopping with printed currency notes, they had so many more conversations than if they just went shopping with plastic. And for me, that's a vital thing when we're seeing that level of interaction falling, and sociologists saying that we live in a time of an epidemic of loneliness. This is a little story that I want to tell you about these guys. This is Dan Edelstein and Hilary Powell, and she's a printmaker, he's a filmmaker in London. They live in a neighbourhood which has been hit really, really hard by government austerity, and they were wondering what they could do about it. So when the last bank on their high street closed, they took over the bank and they turned it into what they called an act of citizen money creation. And what they did was they turned it into a printing press, where they were printing these notes. Now, these are not a local currency. These are art pieces that people buy as art pieces. The people who are celebrated on these notes are not the Queen. The people who are celebrated on these notes are the heroes in that community who are stepping into the gaps that austerity is creating and so many people are falling through. These guys run a project keeping young men out of gangs. This guy mortgaged his own house to turn his garage into a food bank because he could see the level of hunger in his community. This is the teacher at the local primary school where they have lost all of their funding for any arts education at all. And this family here run a kitchen which feeds 200 people 2 meals a day every day of the year. So these notes are printed in 1, 5, 10, 20 and 50 pound denominations. They're printed on one side, and on the other side they're signed. So you're buying kind of limited edition artworks, I guess, in effect. The beauty of this, what they want to do is to raise £50,000. Half of that money will then be distributed between these 4 charities. They also produced these bonds, which they printed to raise money as well. And then their idea is to then spend the other £25,000 to take it to the secondary debt market to buy £1.2 million worth of payday lending debt from that community and then cancel that debt. And they're going to cancel that debt, because they're making a film about it, by blowing a van up. And they're inviting everybody whose debt they cancelled to this event where they explode this van. And if you spent more than £50 worth of bonds, you get invited. And then all the leftover bits of the van afterwards, then they will gather together, melt down and make special coins to celebrate the whole occasion. So this is not a project which is offering an economic solution, obviously. It's not a local currency in that sense. But for me, there's something they're doing that's really important. I'm just writing a book at the moment about imagination. The part of our brain where the imagination fires from and all of the networks with imagination in fire from is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the part of the brain that is uniquely vulnerable to cortisol. When we're anxious, when we're stressed, when we're traumatized, our imagination visibly shrinks. And for me, the lovely thing about these currencies and that kind of playfulness is it enables us to move. Currencies and that playfulness really allow the imagination the space in which to flourish. This is an amazing woman called Rosalie Somerton in Dundee. She runs a project called Art Angel. Art Angel works with people with mental health issues, with anxiety, with stress, with trauma, and they work with them through art and creativity. When you walk through the door there, whether you refer yourself or your doctor refers you, you're not a patient, you're not a client, you're an artist. You're an artist who is preparing work for an exhibition which is held every year in the centre of Dundee. And when they do their evaluation for their funding, they don't ask their artists to fill out long forms and big multiple choice questionnaires. They ask them to represent what the place has done to them in terms of art, in terms of creativity. And this is what one person drew. Before they came to Art Angel, after they came to Art Angel. When I went there, the people who I met there was just the most extraordinary transformation that people had by being around other people. I spoke to the guy who was the director there. He said, fundamentally, we are about creating safety and hope. And for me, that's what we try and do in transition, and it's one of the things that local currencies can really help us to do, I think. So local currencies can enable playfulness, they can enable conversation and connection, they can enable storytelling, they can enable making, and they can enable the formation of new habits. And it's something that the next speaker will talk about on a much bigger scale, I think. So I want to just finish by one of the things that has really intrigued me in writing a book about imagination is when are the times recently when imagination has felt really alive and when anything felt possible? And what did it feel like to be there in those times? Because it's kind of unimaginable in some ways. And one of those times was in 1968 in Paris. And there's some fascinating oral histories around that. It was a kind of a student-led revolution that was really rooted in imagination and creativity and playfulness. The universities were taken over and turned into printing spaces where they printed hundreds of posters every day, which are now worth a small fortune. So people said, Paris was wonderful then. Everyone was talking. Talk to your neighbour were words written on the walls. It was fantastic. May was like that, like living on a constant high. Life was beautiful. The weather was lovely. Everything we did immediately belonged to history. All the hierarchies suddenly dissolved. In that month of talking, you learnt more than in your whole 5 years of studying. Learnt because you could talk to everyone and anyone. And for me, I love the idea that with the local currencies that we create, we can do that. And you know, digital currencies hang on, let me get my thought together. So we started out printing local currencies. That doesn't really work as just a single way of doing it. Then the printed currencies were used as a way to incentivize and promote the digital currencies. I wonder whether we might also look at how the digital currencies and the blockchain currencies might unlock a new culture of making and getting people making tangible things, connecting to each other, and that being a key part of how we build resilient communities. I just want to finish with this. which is that recently I was driving through Lyon in a car at night, and I looked out of the window and I saw this, and I took this photograph. And actually, it's just a normal street with a bollard and a dustbin, but somebody has drawn this little face on here. And for me, it transforms what we see there to being two star-crossed lovers beneath an evening sky, leaning into each other. If this bin could be purring like a cat, it would be purring like a cat. Well, maybe that's just me. Can you see that as well? You know, but this is just a little intervention that has been made that has transformed how that space looks and how that works and the possibilities and the story in that space. I think when we do local currencies and we keep that playfulness and that storytelling strand and that tangible making running through them, that we can do the same thing as well. If you want to find out anything else about, I've put the thing down, about transition, that's me, and there's things on there. And enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you so much for allowing me to start.